Recently on this channel, we've been taking the perspective of the author Jean Twenge, who's a psychologist at San Diego University. She's one of the preeminent experts of generations. And in this part, we're going to look into what exactly is the next generation, Gen Alpha, commonly known as Gen Alpha, and also what's in store for our generation as well. So let's look into it. So first, let's talk about Gen Alpha. She actually has renamed them something else. She calls them the polars. The reason for this is because she says one of the big changes for them will be the melting of the polar ice caps, i.e., that is climate change, and also political polarization. That they're growing up in a world where both sides are hotter, more extreme, and more against each other than ever. And so she calls them polars for that reason. Now, Gen Alpha gets its name because, of course, we have Gen X and then Gen Z, and so they're starting over with the Greek alphabet. Not exactly sure who came up with that, but the naming system of Gen X and Boomers is very fascinating. I'll cover that in another video. But for today, we're going to first look into polars. First, they grew up in an era post-social media, so they haven't known a time in which they didn't have Facebook, Twitter, or X as it is now, which I think is a terrible name, and they didn't have X, they didn't have Snapchat, so they have only known that reality, in the reality where they had those things. Furthermore, they've only known the reality in which they've had smart technology, like iPads, and I'm sure we've all seen the kids who are stuck in the corner of Red Robin, they're stuck in the corner of Olive Garden on their iPad, seemingly like they have no other world outside of that. And that's the world in which they're growing up in today. A world in which is post-COVID as well. Meaning they didn't know a world without masking beginning and becoming widespread. And their first formative memories were of the pandemic. Were of that feeling of totally being unsure as to what was going to happen next with your life and with the lives of those around you. And depending upon the family and how they handled that, that honestly could leave a lot of trauma, a lot of fear and anxiety in the hearts of young people. And that's something she talks about because we're not really sure at this point how that's going to turn out. In some ways, she speculates that actually could turn out to lend a lot of resilience to that generation. She talks about how, for instance, the silent generation grew up with the Great Depression. And indeed, as they got older, they were the ones who had the highest mental health, the best mental health during the height of the pandemic. As the pandemic, when they couldn't see anyone and many of their friends and family were sick, even dying, they were in many cases also the most happy, the people with the most joy and hope in their lives. And she thinks that maybe, and again, this is total speculation, she identifies that as well, that maybe this could be part of the reason why polars will end up having some resilience versus past generations. Along with more screens and more social media, if those things are what impacted our generation, Gen Z, so heavily, and what is partly responsible for our low mental health in many cases, well then she speculates that actually could be the case even more with Gen Alpha. That polars indeed you could look out into the future and it could be even worse than Gen Z, which to think about seems pretty scary. That if it really is social media, and if all these trends stay the same, which of course we don't know that to be the case, right? Something big could change in people's lives. Millennials as parents could be much more proactive about socializing. There could be any number of changes, right? But if things stay the same, they could be on track to have an even worse mental health than we did, which, in my opinion, to take a little bit of a tangent, in my opinion, that makes it all the more important that our generation, that us Zoomers, really look into why this impacts us and what we can do to solve it. Because if we can solve this problem, or at least do something, make some effort, some progress in addressing our mental health struggles, then if this happens worse for our younger brothers and sisters, for our nieces and nephews, then at least they'll have someone to rely on, at least someone to depend on, who might know a little bit about this, who might have some personal expertise on the issue. Because I know us growing up, when we look at our parents and what they've gone through, and a lot of times they just don't understand. They cannot they cannot really see our perspective and what the anxiety, the internalizing disorders we talked about in past videos, what that really is like for us to deal with personally. Because they've had such a different upbringing growing up without technology, they don't see how that could really impact us uniquely, differently than how they would interact with it, because they haven't grown up with the same things. And if that is all the more magnified with the younger generation, then they'll need us, they'll need someone else, they will need some other solution to help us get out of that and move forward. Another super interesting trait with polars is that they're going to be the first non-white majority since the founding of our country, to our knowledge. And that is something that is interesting on a demographic standpoint, but could be interesting from a more personal standpoint. And that for several reasons. First, the biracial category, the other category of being more than one race, that has gone up incredibly quickly. And as a concept, especially considering that our generation values identity so highly and values our different identities and trying to bring them together to form ourselves, if that is the case, then what would that be like for Gen Alpha? It's a fascinating question, because if everyone is that way, then it's a little less unique. It's not as different. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? If you're half black and half Asian, but you also have some Middle Eastern descent as well, right? That could make you a very unique person. So rather than it be something, oh well, everyone's the same because everyone's biracial, everyone's other, that's a possibility. People could think about it like that, and it could be less interesting as an identity marker. But on the contrary, it could become more interesting and more a point of differentiation. So it's a fascinating concept to see how future demographics will impact how people view their identity and how the next generation, polars, how they view themselves. The last thing we'll talk about is the future of education and childhood. And that is, in a world of AI, social media, iPads, iPhones, all of these things, right? What does that technology look like when you apply it in particular to the newest generation? Could education take a total change, especially when you have in-person versus digital learning? Because during the pandemic, many of Gen Alpha, they were the ones on their iPads, right, doing homework, working from home, as it were, right? Even as children, basically doing remote work, remote homework. And that, if that is the case, right, even if they start out with that. Now, I know the pandemic was something special. It's not like the pandemic happens every time. But the difference, though, is that it sets the groundwork for what could be the future, especially with the rise of AI. Could this be a big change in education and what that means for Gen Alpha? Could they have AI tutors? And even now, you can ask ChatGPT for quizzes, for help on what you're doing, for summaries. So how could that be applied to education? How could that be applied to Gen Alpha? And how might that impact them? What might they have AI babysitters? So she starts speculating about these topics, and it is a fascinating one in general. However, AI could miss this entire generation. It could be the generation out after. We don't entirely know. And so this chapter, this part that she talks about, is a lot of speculation. It's really fascinating speculation, because Gen Alpha tends to look like Gen Z but on steroids, like a lot of our traits simply magnified without the context of the past. Because for many of us, we still had our formative years. We still had 1 to 10 basically, where we knew a world without the internet. We knew a world without having our phones right at our beck and call. For a lot of us, even if it was just the first couple of years, we did have some memory, some idea, some anchor to the past, to where we were in the past, to what we were as a culture, as a society before all of these inventions. But on the contrary, on the other hand, polars will have none of that. They will be firmly planted in this post-digital world. And in many ways, that could lead to a lot of our problems, a lot of our strengths too, but a lot of our problems magnified with this generation. And if that's the case, like I said earlier, I think it becomes all the more incumbent on us as a generation to try to overcome our weaknesses as best we can, to try to become the best versions of ourselves, helping each other. And I don't just mean in an individual way, but I also mean create institutions, systems that can help each other. So that way, when this happens, if they do end up being an even more struggling version of ourselves, all of our problems magnified, that we can then be the pillar that they rest on, that we can help them in ways that we weren't able to be helped ourselves. That was a look into Gen Alpha, and more importantly, polars, from the perspective of Jean Twenge and how she thinks things might happen in the future. Next time, we're going to try to wrap up this series on Jean Twenge and talk about how our generation will look like in the future, and overall, summing up Jean Twenge, her thoughts, and generations in general. So thanks for looking into it.